how you take into account whether the books have been cut down. I mean, I saw in some of them there were prickings, but
you didn't send the
if the books were cut down.
Yeah.
So can you speak to how you take into account how that might have changed the relative height versus width?
Yeah. Yes. The question was, thank you, whether I can speak to the fact of whether the pages were cut, and if it was done in a different way, perhaps? Is that where you're going at?
If that would have changed the relative measurements of height and width.
Yeah. No. So the design of the page is the scribe sits down and decides how to make his book, and the leaf he has in front of him, the sheet, the full white sheet, is almost always bigger than the book that he will produce. So he always has to cut. So if you have a very narrow book, then it's sensible to think that that's what he wanted, and that rather than
I meant later owners, perhaps if they've been rebound. I see
no,
a lot
it's,
of
no. It's a very good question. Now I see where you're going. Yes, very good question. The margin size is usually the same as it should be. So the margins are not much narrower than what you would expect, and in that case, you would think perhaps it was sliced and diced. But that's not the case. So the margin space fits perfectly with what the norms are in the medieval period, but the page as such is much narrower. The prickings are, now I fully understand your question. The prickings are also still present in the margins in most of these books, so it's not made narrower at a later point, so to speak.
My question for Eric, it's related to this one. Would it be an idea to, could you circumvent this problem by looking at the written area instead of the measurements of the leaf?
You mean take the written area? Yes, I could. And take that as sort of the main focus of understanding measurements.
Or in addition.
Yeah. Or
in addition.
Yes, yeah, it's very good. Yeah, good point. Yeah, that requires more columns in my table, which was already very broad.
I'm sorry to keep you on your feet with a similar question. I'm wondering if you've related this actually to the shape of the animal skin, because how they got these bifolia. In the examples you looked at, can you see the spine of the animal running across the center of the leaf? Were they getting two bifolia out of each skin, or is it more?
There's no indications that they were trying to squeeze a double leaf out of the part of the skin that was actually too narrow to do so, if you see what I mean.
But it will fit comfortably within the skin to get two bifolia side by side.
Yes.
With the spine running across the center.
Yeah.
So.
Well, okay, you can even say I'm taking some of the height out, so I'm making my double sheet, if you cut like this, I'm making it a little bit further this way, and then have a normal 0.7 ratio, so to speak.
But have you tracked which bit of the skin
no, I haven't.
you're taken
No.
from? That could dictate what size you could economically get out of the animal, rather
Yes.
than waste lots of parchment.
That's a very good point.
Again, it's a question for the same speaker. In the 16th century, there were apothecaries' receipt books were very often in a tall, narrow format,
yes.
and they're sort of, I mean, obviously these are medical, and I just wondered whether this had already begun in your period, and whether there was a connection.
Yeah, very good point. I talked about parchment manuscripts exclusively, because as soon as you go to the paper format, it's just a matter of folding it one time extra, and then you have this long book, which you also find in account books and in administration, etc. Yeah, you find them also in parchment, the narrow books, in administration, but much narrower than what I showed you is actually very rare in the medieval period, and it's not tied particularly to one particular genre, as far as I can tell. It's all over the place. So therefore, perhaps use rather than genre, although these two are connected, of course.
A question to Mrs. West. That's very interesting, but anyway, I'm very curious why they use it in the 19th, 10th, and 11th, 12th century, so many different kinds of paragraphs, so many, because you mentioned in the beginning of that. I'm very surprised. What was the purpose? Because it's so used of quantity, I cannot understand.
Yes.
they have some ideas about it because it's not by accident.
Yes,
And that I have not quite understood.
yes.
Because it's very interesting, yeah? But anyway.
It's a nice question,
Yeah.
and it's a question I also have, I think.
Ah.
Yeah, it's a similar, I mean, we can chat, yeah. It mostly, I think, I mean, there's a lot of different options for scribes, so they can use rubrics and initials and spacing, but you're right, they sort of gravitate towards this paragraph mark. And it might just be in simplicity for the fact that it very simply marks out this line from that line. And it's also super tiny. It can just squish in there at any point. It doesn't require a lot of production. Doesn't require changing the color of your pen for a rubric or getting a decorator to come in and create an initial. So it's very easy to use. So that might be part of it, but it's a speculation. I don't know. It's interesting though because there's a lot of them. Right. Thank you.
Hello. Also, thanks. Also, to this question. Thank you for your speech to start with. Connecting to the same question, I do not know in what way the texts were used in the Middle Ages. Were they read aloud or were they read privately? And if they were read aloud, is there anything known about what has to be done with your voice at the paragraph mark? So right now, at the end of the chapter, of the paragraph, you have to lower or to change your voice depending what you want to do. But is there anything known about that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And yes, it's very relevant as well because it's true that particularly in monasteries, people were reading aloud quite regularly. They're reading in quiet voices, often to themselves. But I'm not sure the actual practice of what happens when you hit a paragraph mark, besides the fact that of the logical sequence that you're reading a line and you hit a symbol, something breaking up that moment, the natural thing would be to just even take a breath there and move on, or to actually stop for just a moment to figure out why that mark is there for the first point, but then also how to continue.
Are there maybe any similarities to music writing?
It's also interesting, yeah, definitely. Yes, of course, because you've got fermatas and you've got all sorts of ways to have a musician stop, but I'll have to look into some missals or some musical manuscripts, and it would be great if I could see paragraph marks being used similarly. Thank you.
Another question for you. Sorry. You mentioned color, and you said the paragraphs are there to steer the eyes to the relevant parts. If there is color available, I think it would be much easier for the eyes to find the parts instead of the paragraphs, because sometimes they really look like letters. So maybe it's just for our modern eyes, but are there any examples where they use color as well in the paragraph marks? Or?
Absolutely, and there's often cases where a scribe in the main hand of the text will write the paragraph in the same color of the text, and then a person will come back with another red pen, whether the same scribe, and will trace over the paragraph to give it even extra oomph. You see that also with initials. A scribe will write a thicker initial, and a rubricator will come over and color that again. So I'm not sure whether certain paragraphs need to be more pronounced than others, or if it happens just to be the fact that they had a rubricator available or a red pen available. But they definitely show up all the time. So thank you.
Yes.
Yes, I also have a question about paragraphs. Maybe a very stupid question, but is there anything known about nomenclature? When did they start calling it a paragraph mark? Because it's clearly used in a lot of other functions as well.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it had anything to do with the change that you didn't cover, that they made the vertical strokes longer in the end, the symbol we know now. Is that anything to do with that it's because it looks like a P, and while it was more a C, referring to chapter or caput? Did it have anything to do with that or not?
That's a fascinating question. I'm very curious as well. Of course, the paragraph is coming from, the word we say paragraph is coming from the Latin paragraphus. The actual history of that word, I'm slightly embarrassed to say I've only taken it as, reading texts and using Malcolm Parks. He's my authority on that particular use of the word. Line there. Does it have it in there? Yes. He
There's,
can answer this for you.
there's probably earlier mentioning of the word, but there's a Leiden manuscript in the BPL collection, middle 12th century, which explains what the paragraph is by using it also, by calling it by its name as well, and a number of other sort of punctuation, reading aids, etc.
That adds to the fact that Anselm of Canterbury, an 11th century author, in his prologue to one of his texts and to his letters, he actually does say, I'd like you to divide up your text using paragraphs so that lest the reader becomes bored. So there is mention of it, but I'm not entirely certain. Well, Eric has shown that it's been used, but as for the P, it may just be coincidence or the fact that we couldn't figure out why we were using a C and for a paragraph, so we made it look like a P to make ourselves sleep better at night, but I don't know why.
Yes, Jenny, you have in your presentation reversed the paragraph mark and turned it into the P of paragraph.
Yes.
Which makes sense, I think.
Yes. I wanted to end on a modern note. I wanted to say we've made it to the future.
But what I also want to point out is that the process you have shown, how the paragraph mark changed and became clearer and clearer during the centuries from the 9th till the 12th, is a beautiful example of the process that David McKittrick has been describing. More and more clarity and dividing up text into easily digestible portions for the reader. What I have missed in your talk at the end is, did the readers indeed notice this? Did they, and were the changes respond to needs of readers? And how did the authors and the scribes and the printers find out about the needs of these? I'm afraid I'm tempting you into an entirely new lecture.
I'll let you have some coffee. You're absolutely right. The evidence is very peculiar because essentially the only evidence we've got is what the printers provide for us. And you would have noticed that two things were happening in the later part of my paper. One was we had a series of editions, quite specifically editions, where editors are coming in, translators are coming in with new ideas for what they thought ought to be a part of the reading process for this text. Breaking it up into smaller parts, referring to part of the marginal notes and so forth, adding, particularly in the English edition, it's very noticeable, it's in the English 16th century edition, a very curious two-line arrangement of running heads. You've got the running heads for the whole thing, you've got the chapter heads, you've got the numbers and you've got the pages. There's a lot to fit onto each page. It gets quite complicated. Now, why did they do that? That's not, clearly it's not part of the ordinary reading experience for anybody in the 16th century to have a two-story running head. And this is something which the editor and working with the printer on a very narrow page, it's only a 12-minute page, it's not so wide. You've got very little space, you can't spread it out. It's what they thought, clearly, was part of the necessary presentation of the text. And I'm much more interested in looking at that kind of work, looking at the typographers and the printers end of the process, working with the editor in this case, rather than looking at what the reader might have said. Because the trouble with a lot of the evidence we've got from where readers are commenting on things, we've just got individual readers. All the work of the reading experience database in Reading and all that sort of thing, it's all predicated on taking up particular individuals and assuming that you can build up from that some general history of reading, which I don't believe is possible. I believe you must start with what the printers believe the readers want, which in turn is reflected in the success of the way that that tradition might be taken up by later printers, or indeed the way that sold in larger or smaller quantities. I think it's that kind of evidence which helps us forward, because it does give you that broad base of evidence.
But then, can you conclude that, I have done it tentatively, that editors, publishers, printers, and authors are, of course, themselves readers.
Yes.
So principally, they responded to their own needs, and all other readers sort of benefited from that.
Yes, but the word I use constantly is compromise. Everybody is working out a compromise between what they want ideally and what the technology or the skills or the materials available will allow them to do. It's essentially a compromise always.
I've got a question for you, Professor Kittrick. You suggested that for the study of typographical evolutions, you need a much broader matrix or scheme to look at books, headlines, and so on and so on and so on. And you also said that these evolutions would best be studied from an international point of view. So looking not just at one single area, but to broader regions and the interaction, the transmissions between regions and so on, if I well understood. So my question would be, which larger regions would you look at if you would have the opportunity to start a broader project about this?
Now, let me explain why it is that I put the emphasis on international first. I think the first thing that has to be said is that for the purposes of a big bestseller, like the Imitatio, or the Latin Bible, take another extreme example, or editions of classical texts in the original language. In other words, books which have got a common language, Latin, which are printed many times, which are only available in some countries. I mean, England didn't print the Vulgate. So one is looking immediately at an international market. It works for some books, of course. For other books, it doesn't work at all, because one can say very well, nobody's interested in reading Flemish books as soon as you get as far as Valenciennes. So it really worked for some kinds of books. But the other part of that is that you have to remember that the type founders are selling their types internationally. France, Low Countries, Germany, Britain, and so forth, just a very simple example. The printers are working internationally. Those two printers I mentioned in Italy, their surname is Britannicus, which suggests they've gone there. We know that the Italian printing was begun by Germans. When in the late 17th century, Oxford and Cambridge wanted printers, they didn't go to the English speakers, they went to Dutch speakers, because the Dutch had better Latin, and they were also more careful. At least for the compositors, the pressmen didn't matter. The pressmen just had to be strong and be able to drink a lot of beer. So in other words, we got a trade, and we got a market, both of which are, for large portions of it, defined in international ways. And you can see some of the evidence. I suspect Nicholas Bigwell may want to talk about the way in which books are traded internationally and the sort of evidence you can get from buying them. But of course it doesn't hold for everything. Flemish is a whole good example. But can I just say one extra thing? Because later on we may be talking about STCV, the short title catalogue for Flanders. The exciting thing about that is that it is introducing images of the title pages. And that is one of the huge disadvantages of the English short title catalogue. It is unillustrated. And I think that with the Flemish one, there is an opportunity here to build on those images and begin to get a better idea of book design and what it means. I'm rather excited to hear more about that later on.
Mrs. Weston, did you realize that these penguins made a career in the legal books of today, the paragraph marks?
No. I didn't realize that. Did you? No. Good point, but no, I'm sorry. That's the short answer.
I have a point for Jenny Weston. Very happy to see you outline the variety of functions that the paragraph mark performed, apart from marking paragraphs, which is a contentious point altogether.
Yes,
paragraphs.
yes, definitely.
From my experience of working with incunibles, I found one particular one that you didn't mention, and that is marking something that's out of place.
Okay, yes.
And a second one that you didn't mention that comes up is they're used very commonly in a text and commentary situation where they're marking a lemma or a quotation from the text.
Yes.
And I do agree, it's very important that this is a contextual mark. I mean, it's a mark that has to be interpreted contextually by the reader, a point that Malcolm Parks makes in his book. I think of it as a sort of Achtung. Something is different about this word, this sentence, and then you, the reader, have to look and decide which of the various things. Is it out of place? Is it a rubric? Is it some other chapter marking of a division?
Yes. In a sense, it gives some control, but also some responsibility to the reader to decipher and to actually read the texts and find out what the marks are there for. Just like we do in our modern texts. Why did they divide them here? Well, let's think about it. So, thank you.
In that sense, it's interesting that your earliest ones did seem to be confined to marking the chapter number.
Yes.
And then you had the broadening of use.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, another question for you, Jenny, which is whether there's any evidence that these marks were added by the readers and not by the scribes.
Yes, absolutely. I'm not sure about readers, but correctors as well. There's definitely cases when you can see that it's in a different pen, which means, again, it's Dr. Eric Kroppel and I were discussing difficulty in dating images and things like dating marginalia, because it's an artistic move. It's a little harder to decipher between letter shapes, a paragraph mark, and so it's a little tough to tell, but it does seem like you've also got some 11th and 12th century texts with a thick black pen coming through, marking a capitulum marker going right over top of the letters. So you can see readers later adding their own. And if you could create a database showing a selection of these where they're very obviously added later, it would be interesting to see what the readers themselves were, how they were interpreting the text, and not just the authors and the scribes themselves. So, yeah, it's a difficult region of study, but if it can be done, it would be fascinating.
Because it personalizes the text.
Oh yes, yes, definitely.
If the reader adds it, it's usually a bit squishy. Whereas normally it's like a normal
Yeah.
Final question. I'd like to ask Eric a question. And that is, he was talking, of course, about how you read these books and stressing the importance of being extremely suspicious about the iconography of reading, or indeed any other human activity. But one thing occurred to me, which might actually be quite useful to think about, if you've got your long book, the A4 fortunately changes itself immediately into a long book. If you read with one hand, you can, of course, hold it in all kinds of difficult ways. The natural way to hold it is like that. Right. Which means that instead of the dirty marks on an ordinary page being down there or down there, the dirty marks actually get to be in the middle. And that might actually be something worth looking at as you look through these manuscripts.
I would like to thank the speakers of today and the chairs for this first session. We will be back, I hope, for the second session at 2:30. And well, with this beautiful weather, you have now the opportunity to discover the city, to discover the campus. I deliberately did not order lunch because that would imply that we would have to stay in this room for the entire day, and as the program is really cramped, it's really full, I think it's a good idea to stretch your feet, have a nice walk, and enjoy the Antwerp restaurants or sandwich bars. For those not familiar with Antwerp, can follow one of our colleagues to various venues, but I also included 8 spots in the direct neighborhood where you can have something to eat. You find this information on the map on page 43, I think. Yeah. So have a nice break, and we'll see each other back at 2:30 in this room, and there will be afternoon coffee at 4 o'clock.